And we're back with a conversation about jail. Not prison per se, it's the warehousing scandal as it is up on the screen. There are over 3,000 jails in the US in nearly every town and every city in the country. And over the course of a year, there will be more than 19 times as many admissions to jail as there are to prisons. So that's what this conversation is focusing on. If jail is meant to hold people who are considered flight risks or dangerous to society before trial, the reality is that jails are actually being used for something entirely different. With me are Stephanie Procell, right here to my left, clinical psychologist, PhD student and former Rikers medical intern, Judge Stephen Leifman from the 11th Judicial Circuit of Florida, serving Miami-Dade County, Marc, Executive Director of the Sentencing Project, and Karin Martin, all the way at the end there, as Assistant Professor of Public Policy here at John Jay. Stephanie, let me start with you. You were at Rikers. Obviously, we were talking about the horrible, deplorable conditions at Rikers earlier. Tell us about the population there and what's it like in jail for them?
Well, I think in general, jail is incredibly stressful. I mean, just for the average person. I mean, if you can imagine quickly of them locking the doors of this room and knowing that you couldn't leave, you didn't know when you were going to be able to leave, you know, what was happening to your family and your freedom been taken away. And you just couple that with the people who are severely mentally ill, who are fighting hallucinations and delusions or maybe manic, and who are trying to cope with all that. It's an incredibly stressful time.
In many ways, we're talking about criminalizing mental illness in a way.
Right.
There's a horrible event that occurred that also was captured on surveillance camera on April 16th. It happened to you, all sorts of long-term injuries, nerve damage, and yet you don't blame the man who punched you.
No. I really truly believe that he didn't act out of malice at all. I think it was really just a symptom of his mental illness. And there was a multitude of factors that was happening that led to that day.
He had been off his meds.
I was told afterwards he was not taking his medication. He was on a different unit, and actually a completely different facility on Rikers Island, and he had been recently moved to a brand new mental health observation unit where he was to get like a higher level of care because he was, an MO unit is a place where they place people who have serious mental illness but who are exhibiting symptoms that they can't be in the general population.
And his case study had not been communicated to you. If you don't blame the inmate, who do you blame?
Really, I believe that Collusion, who was the private company that was providing the mental health care and the medical care to the people at Rikers Island, I feel that if it was communicated to me that he had assaulted 2 women, that's why he was in jail, if he was not being compliant with his medication, he was showing signs at the other unit that his aggression, and that wasn't communicated to me whatsoever. And the fact that he was moved to a new unit without really following the guidelines of just basic treatment. I mean, he was moved without being able to quickly, without being able to terminate the treatment that he was being provided by the counselor's other unit. He was placed in a brand new unit that was understaffed. They opened a new unit with 40 severely mentally ill persons and put 1 clinician, full-time clinician, and a student, myself.
And that was you.
Yeah.
Judge Leifman, let's talk about sort of this idea of criminalizing mental illness. You are a judge in Miami-Dade. Tell us about the forbidden floor and some of the conditions that you see.
Sure. Fortunately, it changed last year. We closed it. But up until a year ago, we had 4 to 5 inmates in a cell for 1. They took turns sleeping. There was no mattress on the bed. They slept on a cold, peeled-painted metal slab. They did not have clothes. They were given something called a Ferguson gown so that they couldn't commit suicide. So most of them just were naked. The lights were on 24/7, and they were only allowed out 15 minutes 2 times a week.
It sounds like the type of snake pit condition that was criminalized 100 years ago.
Or Abu Ghraib. I mean, you look at those kind of conditions, and it's remarkable, what we've done in this society.
And yet you are part of a 2-tiered system that helps sort of identify and treat people who are suffering from mental illness in the jail system.
It's very easy to try to point blame at individual factors, but we're all at blame. This is a huge societal problem. We have over 2 million people a year with serious mental illnesses arrested. We have about 360,000 people on any given day in the United States with serious mental illnesses in jails and prisons, and another 760,000 on community control. And it begins with stigma, it begins with ignorance, it begins with closing all the hospitals and not putting something in to replace it. So I think we're all to blame. But the key is then to figure out how to fix it. And about 80% of the solution rests in the community. And one of the nice things about being a judge is people will come to my meetings even if they don't want to be there. and we have this wonderful moral authority to bring people together to fix these kinds of issues. So 15 years ago, we summoned all the different policymakers that could make structural changes in the community to a 2-day event. And we literally mapped out how our criminal justice system intersected with our mental health system. And what we found is that it didn't, that we, the so-called intelligent policy types, were responsible for the problems that we had created, and we were embarrassingly dysfunctional. So we set up a 2-part system, a pre- and post-arrest diversion program. And listening to Khalil's mom and that story is so heartbreaking because, God forbid he had been arrested in Miami, he would have been out immediately. He would have been in a program. He would have had a peer counselor. He would have had housing, employment, and within a year the charge would have been dropped.
You were talking backstage about the peer counseling and how important it is to provide hope for prisoners, but also the training for police. You tell us about the reduction in recidivism rate.
Sure.
I mean, it's remarkable.
We have over 4,600 police officers. We have 36 agencies in Miami-Dade. They're all trained, and it includes 4,600 plus officers. They go through a 40-hour program called Crisis Intervention Team Policing, where they're trained on how to identify someone with a serious mental illness, how to de-escalate, and where to take them as opposed to arresting them. Between 2010 and 2015, just 2 of the 36 agencies, the 2 largest ones, handled 48,669 mental health calls and only made 109 arrests.
That's remarkable.
And what happened is our jail audit plummeted. It went from well over 7,000 to less than 4,400
You were actually able to close one of the jails.
And we closed one
saving
of our
something
local,
like
in
12
one of the
million,
worst
yeah.
economic periods,
Yeah.
The country's seen. And it's because we became intelligent on how to deal with the problem.
Marc, I want you to shift the conversation a little bit. We're talking about warehousing. Obviously, mental health and mentally ill people are warehoused in jails, but so too are a disproportionate percentage of poorer people. Why is it that we have this sort of disproportionate impact on low-income communities and low-income people?
Well, it starts with the fact that where police are patrolling, who's brought into jail in the first place, so-called quality of life offenses, things like that, can end a person up in jail, a low-income person, in ways that would never happen to middle-class person. It's exacerbated by the money bail system. We have a broad range of ways in which pretrial release takes place across the country. In far too many jurisdictions, money bail is still the primary means of doing so. What money bail ends up doing is basically says, if we have a white-collar defendant in a very serious crime charge, and we set $1 million bail, he may be able to post that $1 million bail. We've got a low-income defendant who has a $500 bail that he can't post. Now, what does that have to do with his likelihood of appearing in court, future risk, anything like that? So there's no place in the system where we have more of a 2-tiered system of justice than at the pretrial stage.
Karin, talk a little bit about the fines and fees. I mean, we know that in theory, debtors' prisons are illegal, and yet?
They have been since 1833, and yet they are rampant across the country. People are taken off the street for not crimes, things that are perhaps quality of life, but being on the sidewalk with a bicycle or drinking on your stoop or being in a park after dark, and are put in jail. And for something that might be a small cost for a lot of people is a debilitating cost to people who end up in that situation. So having to pay a $50 fine or a $200 fine, they can't get out of of jail. The Ferguson report went into this. It's a horrible cycle. People are told one amount and then they're released, but that means they're just sent to the neighboring county, neighboring jurisdiction, and they owe another ticket there. So people are getting caught up in this cycle and they can't get out, and it's only because they can't pay.
And tell me a little bit about the details of the pay for stay scenario that you're talking about.
Well, that's also something that's been outlawed by the Supreme Court ruling, but there are many jurisdictions where people are told almost point blank, and in some places directly, you either pay this fine now or you're going to jail. And I think it's also important to note that some people actually would rather just serve the time, because the threat of the debt and the threat of constantly being under kind of police surveillance and knowing there's a warrant out there for you for not paying is also very difficult to deal with. So I am doing interviews with people, and one person said, he was on parole, and the parole officer said, you have to pay $10 every time I meet with you. And the guy said, you may as well arrest me right now, because I'm not going to have $10, right? And he was, seriously saying, like, I'd rather just serve the time and then have the government not have any reason to chase me versus having this continual debt. So the debt itself is kind of becoming a punishment.
And the debt is also, you have to pay for your sheets, and you have to pay for your food, and you have to pay for...
Yes,
really?
you have to pay for everything. There's a person I talked to who said, I'm still paying for sheets that I laid on 5 years ago. So literally
in jail.
The sheets that he used in jail, 5 years later, he's still being charged for that, the sheet cost.
Marc, you say that it's more difficult to reform jails than prisons. Why?
Well, in part, it's because we have so many, they're so dispersed. We have 3,000 jails around the country. At least when it comes to prison, we've got 50 state commissioners of corrections. You can, as a legislature, have oversight. You can set policies if you want. The jails are largely run as their own little fiefdoms. And so we go from extremes of Rikers, as horrible as it is, at least everybody knows what's going on there. And then you get jails in small rural counties where judges, prosecutors are just running a show there. Very little paying attention to any kind of due process issues, certainly not up to date on how we deal with money bail issues and the like. So the oversight ability of lawyers to litigate unconstitutional conditions becomes extremely difficult to do.
And I gather that your view is that even short stays in jail can have truly negative outcomes.
Yeah, there are many people who say, well, most of the people are in and out of jail within 48 hours, so what's the big deal? Well, it is a big deal. If you've got a job, particularly if it's a low-wage job, and you don't show up for 2 days and you can't call to say why you're not there, there's a good chance you're going to lose your job. People come into jail, as we've heard, with all sorts of health issues, mental health, physical health. In 48 hours, it's very unlikely they're going to get the medication they need or the mental health they need in most jail situations. So you're going to have all those stresses.
Just Leifman, I know a lot of people think whenever you hear about programs, do-good programs, everyone assumes it costs a lot of money and that it can't be replicated, that you have some special slush fund, I'm sure, that you're drawing from. Tell us about it.
We've done a very good job of accessing existing services. So there's a lot of duplication and fragmentation in all of our systems, and that's the key of bringing everybody together. The court has no money. And so what we have to rely on is actually accessing programs that already exist. And we've been very successful at doing that. I'm also part of a national campaign called Stepping Up right now, where we're working with the counties, Council of State Government, and the American Psychiatric Association Foundation to replicate this model nationally.
I understand that you are able to identify repeat cycle folks, that there were 97 people that you identified. Tell me about it. It's such an interesting cost-effective...
Miami-Dade actually has the highest percentage of people with mental illnesses of any urban area in the United States. It's actually over 9% of our general population, which is almost 3 times the national average. So when we started the project, we thought, well, if we could at least identify a couple thousand of the highest utilizers of both criminal justice and mental health services, we could do a better job of getting them the services they need and stop the recidivism. So we commissioned a study through a university, and we asked them to tell us who the highest utilizers in Miami-Dade were of criminal justice and mental health services. So I wait, and I finally get a letter in the mail. I open it up, and there's one piece of paper. And on the piece of paper are the names of 97 people, primarily men, primarily diagnosed with a schizophrenia type disorder, primarily co-occurring, and primarily homeless, who over a 5-year period were arrested 2,200 times. They spent 27,000 days in the Dade County Jail, 13,000 days at an emergency room, crisis unit, or psychiatric facility, and cost taxpayers almost $13 million, and we got absolutely nothing for it. And so there's money out there.
Right.
It's just we spend it in all the wrong places.
In the wrong places.
And it's not nefarious. It's, you know, when we had this summit, it's just we're all so busy doing our jobs. The police are policing, the prosecutor prosecuting, the judge is judging, defender defending, and no one's watching out for this one person who's just severely ill.
Right.
And
It's like
and
a
then,
pinball running through
Yeah,
a
but
pinball machine
what's
being hit by
worse-
all the bumpers and
What's
no one's...
worse is then we punish them
Right.
for not behaving the way we expect, and we don't give them the services they need to behave in the way they can.
Right.
And that's
Stephanie,
what's so
talking
galling.
about those services, you, despite what happened to you, still work in the mental health field. What reforms would you like to see?
You know, looking back at what we were saying here, that when you're mentally ill and have very little money, you don't have advocacy. You know, a lot of these people come to jail and they don't have families to reach out to, and they don't have any money. I mean, I've been at Rikers and have people with bails set at $1, and they don't have $1, so they sit at Rikers for months at a time. But they don't have anybody to reach out to. They're
For the lack of that money.
for lack of that money.
Right.
And I really think if they had an advocate, somebody that could go with them to court, explain to them what's going on, if they have $1 bail. I mean, you know, maybe we could have some kind of fund to help them get out. And we see stories on the outside. I mean, whether, you know, inside jail, it's just increasing their mental illness.
Marc, let's take a look a little bit at money. Everyone says follow the money. Take a look at the money at the system for me. Most people in jail haven't even been convicted of a crime. So in addition to warehousing the mentally ill, there are people like Khalif who are being locked up simply because they can't afford that bail.
They can't afford the bail, or, you know, we've got a probation violation, or a million other things. Now, sometimes, you know, there are public safety issues that come up. We need to address those in a clear way. But there's generally very little systematic overview. You know, so we set a bail on a person who's just been arrested. Is there a bail review to see if that's a reasonable amount and the person can get out? Are there conditions under which we could let that person out and supervise them without relying on money? So we need to look at those kinds of things. We're not, as the judge said, we rarely take a systemic view of how we're approaching these issues. You know, how much of our resources go into jail? If we could cut down jail stays from 6 days to 2 days, that could have a significant impact. Then you've got resources you can put into other things. And certainly, we're using jails because we're not being very creative. Many of these kinds of things don't need to be in the justice system in the first place, or certainly don't require a jail stay.
Karin, how are those distinctions drawn? I mean, let's just look at unpaid fines, for example, the difference between willfully not paying, right, or being truly indigent. How is that determined?
Well, it's completely up to the judge. So that is the Bearden v. Georgia is the Supreme Court case, and so that said that you can only be essentially punished for not paying if it's willful non-payment. The problem is that is entirely up to judges. So if you walk in and you have a manicure, you have nice shoes, or you have a cell phone, a judge can say, "Oh, see, you're willfully not paying because you can afford that manicure. So that means that you are violating the terms of your probation or parole. So I'm going to lock you up." And so the distinction gets very fuzzy in there. And as you were saying, there are completely fiefdoms. I would say it's even goes further and say that law enforcement now has this incentive to pursue things that will bring in money to certain jurisdictions. And in Ferguson, again, so
I was going to say that harkens back to the DOJ report,
Right.
because it really talked about drawing the lines and seeing collusion between the government branches to generate revenue off of people, primarily poor people in Ferguson.
Very explicitly. So the city manager talking to the judge, talking to the
Tell them
police
about
chief.
the emails in that report.
Well, it said, I talked to the police chief. I told him that we have this bottom line. We need to increase revenue by X amount. He said he could do it. I mean, it doesn't really get any clearer
pretty
than that.
blank.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty
and
blank.
they're targeting, in that situation, they were targeting primarily our African Americans, primarily people who don't have a lot of money. And again, it was just putting people into this system. There's one, and I would just add to this issue of people not being able to afford bail. We are also in this situation where most states now charge for indigent defense. So indigent means you have no money, and so we're charging people who have no money for representation. And it can be $5, but it can also be $400, right? And that flies to the face of
It goes to a
rationality.
further level, though. The tax structure in the country has changed so much that we go to a fee base. So if you get a speeding ticket in Florida and 2 other tickets, it can be $3,000. And so then you have to go to work and you keep driving, and then you get pulled over. Now it's a criminal offense of driving on a suspended license. So you come in, and then you have the court cost on top of it. And in Florida, if you don't pay your court costs, they suspend your license again. And people get into a hole that they never get out, and they
Can't
just
dig
end
out.
up in jail because the policies are so skewed against them.
We only have a minute left. I want you each to give us your final thoughts. Where do we draw the political will? Look towards the future for me. What should we all be thinking about, Stephanie?
I think really just an attitude, thinking of mental illness in general, just our attitude that people need help, regardless of where they are, and to be able to have people believe that money is needed in that area. I mean, people think about, if you ever read the comment sections, but if they're in jail, for some reason they need to be punished. And regardless of whether they're ill or not, there's an attitude in the general public that these people don't need treatment. And I think if we could work on changing that attitude, that we can get money to these systems and hopefully not house severely mentally ill people in the jail. We can have separate facilities like they do in Miami.
Judge Leifman.
Look, people with mental illnesses are just people who happen to have an illness. They have the same needs and desires and dreams of everybody else. And they unfortunately have been so marginalized and abused in our society, it's hard for them to even want to get help at this point. And so we have to make systemic changes in the community that offer them a way out and an opportunity for hope. And when you do that, it is absolutely remarkable the results that you can have.
We've gone from deinstitutionalizing them and then putting them in a different institution,
There's no doubt about it.
basically. Marc.
I work on policy change every day, but I think one of the things we really need to do is tell stories. The courage of Khalif's mom to be able to tell that story. I think there are far too many people in this country who just refuse to believe or won't accept the reality of what's happening in the justice system every day. We need to bring that home, and not everybody's going to read the policy reports or go to the legislative hearings. So we need to make that come alive, and sometimes it takes a tragedy, but at least we can get something out of it, I think.
Marc, thank you.
And I would just add that the best way to denigrate your own dignity is to denigrate somebody else's, and that's essentially what we're doing in the criminal justice system right now. And I think we need to understand that everybody is a human being, everybody has human dignity, and go with that.
Powerful thoughts. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. Thank you.